In this episode of Voice of the Sea, we talk with researchers working on the Reefense R3D project to develop a hybrid living and artificial reef that dissipates wave energy and protects the shoreline, while also providing habitat for corals, fishes, and other marine life. We head to the Hawaiʻi Institute of Marine Biology to learn about the research and check out innovative technologies, from selective breeding of resilient corals to underwater speakers used to attract marine life to the reef. We start off talking with R3D Project Director Ben Jones from the University of Hawaii Applied Research Lab.
What we are designing is a series of arrays that kind of replicate what a natural fringing reef does, which is attenuate a dramatic amount of the wave energy as it approaches the coastline. What we will develop in this 5-year program is a prototype. Prototype to show that you can both reduce the wave energy and also harbor a living ecosystem. The size of this initial structure will be about 50 meters along the coastline and up to maybe 150 meters across coastline, so kind of a long slope. There will be 2 of these deployments. So in the end, it'll be 100 meters wide by about 150 meters. So typically this takes, decades to centuries to develop this type of for nature to grow a fringing reef. And we're trying to do that in a matter of years. And so my role is kind of to integrate all of these different groups, both across institutions, but probably more importantly is across disciplines. We have engineers, ecologists, data analysts, tons of biologists and divers. We have over 30 people at the University of Hawaii working on the project. And then in addition to that, there's over a dozen at these other institutions that we're partnering with, including Florida Atlantic and UCSD, and then a small team at Mackay Engineering supporting. So it's quite a large project. It's the largest project we at Applied Research Lab have managed to date. Applied Research Lab is a university-affiliated research center. We're one of 5 Navy-sponsored UARCs, as they're called, across the country. Our role is really to connect university research with Department of Defense needs.
And when you get to the point where you're actually manufacturing these large structures, where will that happen?
Yeah, we hope to do that right here in Hawaii. So our engineering partner on this project is Mackay Ocean Engineering. They will be subcontracting out the various concrete vendors that do this work, but we're hoping to do the work locally. There's such a need for coastal protection that we hope that what comes out of this can lead to an ecosystem of businesses that can support this type of work, because there's so much work needed to protect ring roads around the islands and other infrastructure. The first prototype is supposed to will go into the water next June. So that's 2 years into the project. By the end of the 5 years, the extension, the next 50-meter extension, will go in the water. If those are successful, we anticipate those stay in the water and do what they're supposed to do. At that time, in 5 years, I think we would also be prepared to start looking at other sites to put in actual systems.
Coral reefs have always been the main protection for coastlines. And the reason that we're seeing issues now is that those coral reefs are degrading. And that's in response to our anthropogenic impacts, which are all of our land-based pollutants that have been going into the water for many, many years. The site that we chose at Fort Hase in Kailua Bay, that's part of the Marine Corps base, we really selected it because there's some living corals, but there's not a ton. And we also checked that all of the species that we plan to put on the structure already exist in Kailua Bay, so we're not introducing any new species. The one new thing that we are doing is to bring the selectively bred corals from Kaneohe Bay around the corner to Fort Hase and Kailua Bay. There's not a reef there that's really protecting the coastline, and that's why all of this erosion is happening, and it's starting to threaten the roads that are there and everything.
Looking to the future, can you describe for me what success for this project will look like?
Success for this project, I think, is just having a thriving, living reef out there that is dissipating wave energy and protecting the coastline.
The fastest growth scenarios, we can get something that looks like a 40-year-old coral colony in 1 year of growth.
Wow. So when this structure goes in the water, do you see it already equipped with the 3D modules and corals already on it? Or will it be naked and then divers will go and populate it?
We're envisioning it will be put in naked. So that is an engineering feat, and the ocean engineer team will deal with that. And so they'll put out a structure, and then what we will be doing is making these structures that are skinned over to make them look like very large corals, and we'll be attaching those things all over the outside to try to make it function like a coral reef. If we're going to build one of these structures to protect the local community's roads, we also want them to be able to feed their families at that place. We want those traditional practices that increase the nearshore productivity and food security of our communities involved. I went and I met with the Ko'olapoko Hawaiian Civic Club. I presented our idea. I asked their permission to go after this proposal. We've involved them and their ideas throughout as we've been developing this project. We have a group that we are getting advice from. But if this is going to be expanded and go elsewhere, that's the critical part that we need to engage local communities to find out what they want out of these structures beyond just wave attenuation. This project has been a success. If when we are all said and done, we have increased the biodiversity and the food security of our local community, that they can feed off of that reef, they have food security, and their road is also protected, and they don't have to worry about it washing away in every storm. That's the goal.
The University of Hawaii Sea Grant College program, focused on Hawaii's coasts and its communities through sustainable development, safe seafood supply, sustainable coastal tourism, hazard resilience, and healthy coastal ecosystems. Hawaii's Sea Grant.
You're watching Voice of the Sea. We're learning about research to rapidly grow corals and deter algae growth as part of the Reefense R3D project.
All the experiments that we do, all of our work focuses on elevating temperatures to create stressful conditions for corals. And really what we're looking for is the natural way that some individuals are more tolerant than others. Being at HIMB, we're really fortunate to be so close to the reef. We have really amazing access, and that enables us to do an opportunistic style of science where we revisit corals all the time. So we have a library of individuals out on the reef that we actually know and we visit and we see all the time. Some of those corals we visit and put nets on and collect those gametes during the spawning events. They've been identified as thermally tolerant in a variety of different ways. We both have used the outcomes of the stress tests we do here, but also observed them during natural bleaching events over the past 5 or 6 years. You find that some parents are really, really tolerant and they don't tend to suffer very much during a high temperature event, and some are a lot more sensitive. And so we kind of leverage that outcome to do the selective breeding work. We're standing in front of our major stress testing system. These little boxes here have a Raspberry Pi computer inside of them that we use to control the temperature inside the tanks. And these cords going into it are temperature probes, and these hoses have hot and cold and ambient water. And we can feed these relatively sophisticated profiles or lists of temperatures we want to be played at certain times, and the tanks will recreate those. And so we use that to do stress testing, which is kind of one of the primary ways that we evaluate the climate tolerance of corals. There's lots of corals out there and they have a range of different traits, and so one of the things we're trying to understand is how we can identify the traits without actually needing to harvest that individual and do a bunch of experiments on it. So these are called biomarkers, and they're any range of kind of molecular or cellular markers inside of the actual tissue of an animal that relates to what its traits are. In particular, we've been using this approach called metabolomics, where we basically take a tiny piece of coral like the size of rice and we soak it in a methanol, and then we run it on a machine with one of our collaborators, and it helps us identify all the different biochemicals that are inside that coral. We get these really amazing data sets that tell us all about the chemistry of the individual organism and look for ways that correlates with the experimental performance. And so once we've developed that sort of training set to understand what's going on, we can look at new corals that we don't know anything about, only take that rice-sized piece of tissue, run the same kind of methodology, and identify whether or not that coral is more or less likely to be really climate hardy. These are individuals from spawning last June, and we're doing a stress test in here to explore two different things. The first of which is if the selectively bred corals actually survive better than their control counterparts. So those are the ones that come from known thermally tolerant parents, and are we getting the outcome we really want when we start heating up the water? And the second of which is looking at the chimerism and the differences between those corals that settle as an aggregate of a bunch of different individuals, siblings, if you will, that are all nested together versus single corals. And so what we find is that corals, when they're settling after a spawning event, will sometimes settle in this little clump, different individuals, different genes, and then they kind of fuse and all grow together. And our previous work has shown that those individuals behave very differently than coral larvae and juveniles that settle on their own. So we're trying to understand if that behavior also includes some kind of climate phenotypes or climate traits that are useful for this project.
What are you most excited about so far in the project?
I just really like the idea of, developing an artificial reef that functions. That's it. I think, and with this project, we really have the ability to develop breakthrough technologies and really push the frontier. And that's not common. So this is an exciting project for us.
Can you describe for me some of the new approaches that you're talking about?
Yeah, for instance, printing in 3D with living cells, that is something that actually comes from tissue engineering, precision medicine, where people have been trying to develop artificial liver systems and so on. And we're taking this technique from medicine and we're translating it into coral reef science, into marine biology. And that's really something that is exciting and new. What we are trying to do is to seek inspiration from nature. One of the things is to recreate a microhabitat that we think is beneficial for the settlement of coral babies. So we're looking at natural substrates that enhance the recruitment of corals, and we image it in 3D, and then we try to 3D print those structures. We're developing a printing process that is good for cell growth. So we're developing primarily hydrogels. So hydrogel is like jelly. Remember, in the kitchen you have jelly, gelatin, and so on. So we're developing these types of jellies that can encapsulate the cells and provide a 3D environment. We can create a material that prints when you shine light on it. And we use UV blue light for this. So once you shine light on it, it cross-links, so it solidifies, and it creates this structure, this hydrogel. So when you have a normal 3D printer, you have the nozzle, and the filament comes out, and it goes like that. What we do is we illuminate a pattern. And where the light is patterned is where the tissue or the structure forms. So for instance here, what you can see is the structure. We printed this grid,
right,
and we printed the Reefense logo, right? And the way it is done is that we have filled this Petri dish with our solution that we call the bio ink, and then we shine light, but only on the areas that you can see here. And the rest just washes away. But then we're also extracting chemical signals that natural algae produce. We're extracting them, and we encapsulate them into a material that then slowly releases these chemicals.
And why do you want to release the chemicals?
So it's like a signal, basically. So once the larvae is in proximity to the surface, it decides where to settle. So we wanted to settle in a certain spot on our artificial reef.
Tell me about the other side where you're trying to actually discourage growth of the algae.
Yeah. For a lot of coral reefs, especially the ones that are nutrient polluted, turf algae and other types of algae are competing with corals. What we want to do is to minimize this competitive interaction. And for this, we're developing materials that can inhibit the growth of these algae. We have these materials that make the algae just slip off, and we can put them in proximity to fragments of corals that we outplant on the artificial structures. That way, that fragment can grow healthier and faster without competition.
We are looking for a few heroes, mentors, trailblazers, innovators, a passion to change lives, spark curiosity, open hearts, and awaken minds, help students answer the question, who am I? This could be your calling, but this is no job. It's the journey of a lifetime. Be a hero. Be a teacher.
You're watching Voice of the Sea. We're learning about research to attract baby corals and fishes as part of the Reefense R3D project.
My specialty is underwater acoustics, particularly tracking marine mammals and other things using sound. Well, I'm part of a sub-team on this project that's called ecosystem engineering, which is trying to attract or encourage animals other than coral larvae to settle on the reef. One of my tasks is to see if we can attract fish that are good for the reef to loiter around the reef. And a technique that's been discovered over the past 20 years is if you can play sound from a healthy reef, that seems to encourage baby fish or even baby coral larvae to settle on the reef and grow. We're trying to reproduce results that suggest you can double the number of fish on a reef by playing back sound.
How do you go about knowing what sound to play or how loud to play it or when to play it?
Right. Well, the first step is to listen to what's already out there. So all around Hawaii for many years, various scientists have been making recordings on the coast of all the different islands. So there's actually a fairly large library available of the natural sounds. In addition, as part of this project, I've been starting to record sounds in this area. That's going to be where we're going to deploy the bigger structure as we get to the later phases of the project. Then what I try and do is I try and look for patterns in the sound. I'm saying, does the sound change with the phases of the moon? Does it change with sunrise and sunset? Does it change if the water temperature changes? And all this is important for helping us to choose and decide what kind of sound we should play back to attract fish at a certain time of year under certain water conditions. We're also curious to see if we can encourage coral to grow or settle and then grow using sound as well. So we'll be examining that. Sound scientists like me, it's impractical for us to listen to sounds for long times. So what we do is we often convert them to a picture that we can then interpret. And this picture is called a spectrogram. So what this shows the frequency content of a sound over time. This is 1 second of sound, and this shows the frequency content up to 2 kilohertz, which is basically this range of human speech. Basically, these are a series of tones being made by fish, whereas these are a series of pulses being made by some sort of other animal.
How do you know it's being made by a fish?
People have been able to both film fish and record sounds at the same time. Fish generally make sounds that are within this band of frequencies. And so researchers tend to know that anything below 600 hertz tends to be a fish call. The second thing I'm interested in testing is humans can hear a certain range of sound, but there's a lot of sounds in the world that humans can't hear. And so anything above what we normally can hear, we call ultrasonic. And it turns out that a lot of the measurements I'm making of the coral reef just off of Coconut Island is in the ultrasonic range. We can't hear it, but it's out there. I'm curious to see whether ultrasonic sounds are something that fish larvae respond to. So I'm interested in doing an experiment where I do just normal sound humans can hear, and then I'm going to add additional ultrasonic sound for another test and see what happens. And these are sounds either being made by snapping shrimp or other types of animals that are living in the coral reef. Anything you see in this section below are sounds that we can hear, but anything above here is what we can't hear. And one thing I've gotten curious about is that there's actually a lot of energy in the ultrasonic range, which isn't typical for a lot of the ocean. So a sign that you're near a coral reef may be that there's a lot of ultrasonic sound, which is why I'm curious if it's important to play back the sound when you're trying to imitate the sound of a healthy reef. The sound that's being made on a coral reef changes during the day. Just as like you have a rush hour, right? And if you listen to the traffic sounds on the road, you can hear at certain times of the day a road's busier than others. It turns out the coral reef has kind of traffic jams during the day. During sunrise and sunset, the animals are making many, many more sounds than they are in the middle of the day or at night.
Is there any worry that the sounds that you're going to play on this artificial reef would be loud and damaging to nearby marine life?
That's a fair question. The level of sound we're going to play is such that it'll be indistinguishable from the natural background sound in the area about 100 feet away from the source. Based on the levels we're estimating and the fact that we're trying to limit to only about 25 to 50 meters range, the level of sound here is much, much lower than even a motorboat going by. And motorboats can be pretty loud.
Yeah.
My role is to figure out how the shape of habitat can attract corals and make them grow better. Habitat complexity is one of the most important things. If you don't have habitat complexity, reefs don't grow back as well. After, say, a disturbance, like a bleaching event or a hurricane, if it wipes out the complexity and makes it flat, it takes 2 to 3 times longer for it to start growing back. There are 3 dimensions of what we call habitat complexity. One of them is just simply the height of a surface. And then you've got one which is how much area is within that surface. And then you've got a third one, which is called fractal dimension, which sounds really complicated, but it's just how that area is folded into the volume, into a space. And so if there are a lot of little folds, like a really complicated coral colony, then the fractal dimension is high. And it just means you've got a lot of different niches for plants and animals to live. So you've got high light, low light, high flow, low flow. Whereas if you've got low fractal dimension, it's more like a smooth surface. And so with those 3 metrics, what we do is we try and figure out what those values are in the real world and try to reproduce them using simple geometries like you see here.
About the different materials that you're using and the different shapes and sort of why you're approaching it. These I see are round and those are kind of more like hills, and they're some made out of clay, some made out of cement.
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, we're using clay because we can 3D print in clay, and we can rapidly create different shapes and sizes and so on that we can use in experiments. But when it comes to scaling up and creating a reef where we're making hundreds and hundreds of these things, we wouldn't use clay. We would use concrete casting or something like that. And as far as the different shapes, we know that these crevasses are really important for capturing coral larvae as they're coming past on a wave. They're not very good swimmers, so they need to get caught in the structure. But also, it creates edges for them to settle on where there isn't as much algae, because the algae will be on the sunlit surfaces, because they need the sun, and so it gives them little places to get through that early life part.
Well, you'd mentioned when you were talking about the project that in addition to the work that you're doing for the 3D reef, you're also have found some scientific findings that are interesting just generally.
We are finding some very interesting things, especially some interesting things about the main Hawaiian island archipelago. We've been able to look at how the habitat complexity changes across the islands with depth, around the islands with wave exposure, and also with the age of the reef. The main Hawaiian island stretches from 5 million years old to about 200,000 years in some areas of Hawai'i island. In all these places, depending on their wave exposure and the depth at which you find reef, they have different shapes. And we've been able to kind of characterize those. By characterizing how reef shapes are out there, if we want to put in a hybrid reef somewhere, we can, based on its environment, think about what shapes we should be using to create that reef with.
Hawaii's shorelines are eroding at historic rates, and development of hybrid living and artificial reefs could protect our coasts, while also providing benefits to people and the environment. To see and learn more about Reefense and the UH-led R3D project, visit voiceofthesea.org. Follow us on social media at Voice of the Sea TV. Mahalo for watching Voice of the Sea. Exploring Our Fluid Earth is the dynamic curriculum developed by the University of Hawaii's Curriculum Research and Development Group. The award-winning Fluid Earth and Living Ocean textbooks are now interactive and online. New activities, updated content, and a teacher community. Exploring Our Fluid Earth is now freely available. Find out more at exploringourfluidearth.org.